Welcome to Teaching Artist Podcast, a show dedicated to discussions of teaching art to kids, making art, and how those things overlap and feed each other. I'm Rebecca Potts, your host, a visual arts teaching artist. This week's episode is powerful and inspiring. Before we hear from Adjoa Burrowes, I want to share a reminder that our exhibit, See Where It Takes You, is on view now at tapexhibit.com. Go check it out. Help us spread the word by sharing it with your friends, family, students, fellow teachers, and artists. Thank you. Adjoa Burrowes has had several successful careers, and it was such an honor to talk with her about her art practice, teaching, and children's books. She spoke about narrative and the importance of telling your own story and ensuring that students have opportunities to tell their own stories. I was so moved and inspired by this conversation. I hope you feel the same as you listen. Adjoa Burrowes is a mixed media artist and educator. Her multifaceted career includes decades as a graphic designer for major corporations and illustrating over a dozen picture books, including Grandma's Purple Flowers, which she also authored. Her journey as a teaching artist includes years teaching in the National Museum of Women in the Arts, Bridging Communities and Arts, Books and Communities, ABC, program in 12 schools, and 11 years developing art residencies as a teaching artist with the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in dozens of schools in the D.C. metropolitan area. Burrowes has a BFA from Howard University in printmaking and an MA in art education from the Corcoran School of Art at the George Washington University. In her current art practice, she creates abstract mixed media prints, collages, and sculpture from reclaimed cardboard that address issues of consumerism, decay, and rebirth. She lives and maintains a studio in Northern Virginia and is an elementary art teacher at the Flint Hill School in Oakton, Virginia. And I have to thank Nikki Brugnoli, who introduced me to Adjoa. So thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Adjoa. It was so wonderful to speak with you. Let's get into the conversation. So I'm here with Adjoa Burrowes, who has had, we were just saying, sort of several successful careers. And I love to start just getting a little background. So could you kind of talk us through your story? And one of the questions I always ask is, how did you become an artist? And then also, how did you become a teacher? And did one come first?
Okay. Well, definitely the art came first before the teaching. I grew up in Chicago, born and raised in Chicago, and I came of age at the tail end of the Black arts movement, which was characterized generally from the 60s to the mid-70s. Mm-hmm. And this movement, it was kind of morphed out of the Black Power movement and created this whole new generation of artists and writers and poets. Primarily, their objective was to create these politically engaged artworks that drew upon the history and the culture of African Americans. So that was like my backdrop, right, as a young person growing up in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So my consciousness as an artist was informed by this movement, the Black arts movement, and all the subsequent art and learning experiences I had after that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of these art and learning experiences I had at the Southside Community Arts Center, which, of course, was on the south side of Chicago. Yeah. And I took free art classes there. There were events and exhibits there. I participated in exhibits there and engaged in all this communication with all these professional artists. And when that started, I was just in high school. I was like a junior and senior in high school. So that was like so big. Wow. And I joined like this organization called NCA, which stands for the National Conference of Artists. And it's one of the oldest Black art organizations in the nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even as a young person, after I graduated from college, I headed up the Chicago chapter, and we had the 25th National Convention there in Chicago. So all of those experiences were just so rich and pivotal for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I started out as an artist from high school. I went to a magnet school, Lane Tech, where you could actually major in art. And at that time, it was unusual to have a school where you could major in art or music, but I was able to do that. So that was great too. That launched me as an artist, in addition to those experiences.
Was that school in your neighborhood, or did you have to travel to go to Lane Tech?
Yeah, it wasn't in my neighborhood, and that was different for me too. I had to take a bus and a train to get there.
Yeah.
But it was, of course, so worth it.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm. And then the other pivotal experience was my experience at Howard University.
Mm-hmm.
I was recruited by this artist named Jeff Donaldson. And Donaldson was one of the founders, one of 5 artists founders of this organization called Africobra. And Africobra started in the 60s in Chicago in 1968. And their whole thing was creating this aesthetic, this Black aesthetic, this new Black art aesthetic that was separate and different from the whole Western canon of art.
Yeah.
So that was incredibly exciting for me. Having had the experience of going through Howard University at that time in the mid-70s, it was just a super vibrant, energetic period. And several of my artists were Africobra members. And then all the artists, I just thought that they were all amazing, and they had careers of their own, notable careers of their own. So my whole experience in Chicago, and then that pivotal experience going through Howard in the 70s, all of those things kind of shaped who I am, who I was as an artist,
Yeah. Oh, amazing. And do you feel like as a teacher, thinking back to you having those experiences, do you try to bring that type of experience to your students?
Well, yeah, the exposure to the world of art, the fact that art just doesn't exist like right here only in your neighborhood, but it's also connected to other people and other movements, and energies around the world, really.
Right. And then also, I feel like just hearing your story, that a big part of it was also having role models, like having, representation, being exposed to the Black arts movement, and having these Jeff Donaldson at Howard, having these role models.
Oh, absolutely.
Throughout your young art career.
Yes, it was quite nurturing, because during that time when I was in high school, even I was always like the youngest kid on the block kind of thing. So people definitely took me under their wings. There was this artist, activist, amazing woman, Margaret Burrowes. Her name, our names aren't spelled the same, People used to say, "Oh, is that your mother?" I'm like, no, but I wish she was. But she was this powerhouse artist in Chicago, and she was one of the founders of the Southside Community Arts Center. It started in the 40s as a part of this whole WPA.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the few remaining WPA institutions. But she was great. She was always approachable. She, would advise me on things. So I felt like I had this vibrant, very real community of artists, that were nurturing me during that time. And I remained in touch with all those people throughout, because of the NCA, the annual conferences and everything. So rich beyond measure, just incredibly rich.
Yeah, amazing.
And my professors at Howard, Lois Mallow Jones, painter, she's like one of the few African American artists represented at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Scholars, just, artist scholars, James Wells, who was a printmaker, a very notable printmaker, just an incredible lineup of artists, thinkers. Yeah, it was just amazing.
Yeah. And then how did you become a teacher as well? When did that come into your career?
Yeah, the teaching came as a result of my work in children's books, because my children were young at that time, and their teachers would often ask me to come into the classroom, share share my books and my process with the kids. So the seeds of my teaching started there. And that was like in West Virginia. And again, I was working as a graphic designer at a newspaper when I started illustrating books. But it feels like I've always had my foot in publishing. While I was at Howard, I worked on the newspaper, the school newspaper. I had a comic strip that I did illustrations for the paper. And I also did covers of books for small presses like in New Jersey. So it was the publishing part that kind of launched me into my teaching. And then I started a lot of community-based art teaching with different organizations, reading organizations, because of my connection with books. So these were like teaching artists opportunities, some informal, maybe it would be a thing where I do something once a month or so. And then I started teaching on a regular basis with the Kennedy Center in their Arts in the School program, where you were scheduled for a year interacting with, in one season, maybe 4 or 5 different schools.
Right.
And the thing that was great about that was you were able to design your own residency, your curriculum, which was really nice. And I always focused on the bookmaking and the art making because of the natural connection between myself as an artist as well as a book writer and illustrator.
Yeah, amazing. And how many kids do you have?
Oh, I have 3.
And do you feel like when they were young, were you still, you were doing graphic design and then also illustrating children's books? How were you kind of managing time? And this is a little bit of a selfish question. I only have one kid, but I find it tricky to manage time.
It's hard. It's extremely hard and stressful, but you manage because I'm really driven in that way to create artwork, because in addition to even doing the stuff that I'm commissioned to do, I was also doing my own work, my own paintings and prints.
Right.
You don't sleep very much. Given a work day, and then you come home and you do all the things that are necessary for your family, and then it's like you have this shadow life that starts at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, and you work until 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock on other things.
Yeah, so familiar.
yeah. But I must say, like my major at Howard was printmaking, and I love that medium. Sometimes it can be difficult because you do need back then you needed to press more, even though you can do some hand printing, but now they have these plates, these gelatin plates, which makes it really easy for you to print at home. So that's been very liberating.
Yeah. So now do you do most of your monotypes, monoprints with the gelatin plates?
When I don't have access to a press, like all during this period where we were sheltering in place, I've been doing I've been doing the monotypes at home, but occasionally I will have access to a press because I prefer, I can't say I prefer because I both of the medium, both ways of working are great. But when you want to do large, it's nice to be able to have a press.
Yeah, definitely. It's a little harder to make something large with your hands.
Yeah. And I just feel like I was so lucky that during this time that I was able to work at home and that my studio was organized, because it was really funny because we actually started around March 14th or something like that, when, they made the declaration, national pandemic. And like weeks before that, I just felt like compelled to clean my studio up and get it, organized. And part of that was because we were going on a spring break. And I thought, I have to have things in order so that I can move straight into that. Because, when you work full time, whenever you have a break, it's like, oh my goodness, you really want to be organized so that you can produce,
Yeah. And so you already had, your studio was at home?
Yes.
So that's like your normal studio. So you didn't have to worry about not being able to access a studio space.
Right. Which, that I was very fortunate in that.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that's a tricky thing. And getting kind of into teaching a little more, how has this been in terms of teaching, this shift to online, and kind of how have you managed that?
Well, I think having that background in graphic design has helped me with, being familiar with programs like the Photoshop and Illustrator and all that, that has helped. I don't do any digital teaching. I don't teach any of that.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to I just wanted to be in the hands-on part.
Yeah.
Because that's important to me, especially in this day and age,
Right.
So, I was able to jump in. It was very hairy. Extremely stressful because luckily, at least we had 2 weeks to transition to ed because it came at the time of our spring break. But many of my friends that also teach, they didn't have that. They had maybe a week to transition into that, right? And my school toyed or toggled between like asynchronous and synchronous learning. And in the beginning, we were only asynchronous. And with all of the challenges that presents, right? Not being able to see the kids and having to do those videos. I mean, the first video I did, it took me like 8 hours to do.
Right. It takes so much more time than just teaching in person.
Yes. And it's so funny because people that are outside of the art education, they have no idea. They think, that should be fun. You get that all the time. That should really be fun. I'm like, really? But it's challenging because you want to make sure that you give them everything, right? You give them the background and your lessons are clear, your objectives clear. You have the steps that are necessary. So it's extremely challenging.
Yeah.
But one thing I always did in my lessons, I thought it was important. I always try to introduce an artist, talk about their process, show their work, and then launch into the creation of our pieces that were based on it, or inspired by that. Like one of the lessons I had for 5th grade, we explored the art of, I think his name is Moody, the last name, and he was a botanist as well as a photographer. So we looked at some of his work, and then I challenged them to go outside and photograph something in nature that intrigued them and take several views of it. So for me, I thought it was important for them to look at things in different lights, not only physical light, but different ways of looking at an object.
Yeah.
This artist, he would actually dissect a flower, and then he would take the pieces and compose them on a page and photograph them.
Wow.
It's incredible work. They didn't have to dissect, but I had them to take different views of flowers, really super close-up view, and then some other views that intrigued them,
Yeah.
and develop like 3 or 4 pieces that they could send to me. So that was like one lesson.
Yeah. And the artist was Moody. What was his first name?
I can't remember his first name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's all right. I'm just curious because he sounds really interesting.
And I hope I got his last name right.
Yeah. I know there's so many that we share with kids.
So, the biggest challenge for me going into this virtual teaching was the fact that there was no consistency in terms of what the children had at home to work with. Right. So, of course, some kids had paint. Kids that enjoyed art and gravitated toward art, of course, they had all kinds of stuff. But then the person that's kind of on the fence with art, especially like 5th grade, they were, they'd have a pencil. They may have markers. They had crayons, but not all pastels, So the challenge was to find projects where they could have options. And so, I always gave them options in terms of materials. And I always tried to use materials that recycle materials in the home and also explore materials that were found in the natural world.
Yeah. I found myself doing the same, and then kind of being grateful that we were coming to the summer as I started to run out of ideas for, okay, how else can I remix cardboard and like leaves and
right. Yeah.
And how was your teaching style kind of before all of this? Were you kind of structuring lessons the same way, or did teaching online really shift the way you worked?
I guess the major way it shifted was in terms of the flexibility of material.
Right.
And I think one thing that teaching virtually allowed maybe more opportunity to investigate other artists and art history, whereas I'm more I'm more into the making. They do some research, but not a whole bunch.
Yeah.
I think that's important, but I like the making more.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of do the same thing. And I agree that I felt like I was able to maybe ask them to spend more time looking at videos of artists or just thinking about sort of where the artist came from than I was able to in the classroom. And part of it was just time. Like I want to emphasize studio time.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like you're saying, the making, but having the ability to send them lessons that have, that maybe take more time than the time we would have been given in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that is one of the benefits to all of this, a little silver lining.
And then another unexpected outcome of it was that the kids, especially the younger kids, because they'd kind of depended on their parents to sometimes interpret the lessons, to read to them, like in the really younger grades, K and 1. And it allowed this engagement, which was kind of nice. Like I had one student tell me, they posted the results of one of their activities and said, well, my mom kind of helped me with this, but just a little bit, And I was like, interesting. And then I had another kid whose mom actually did the lesson separately alongside their child, which I thought was nice, Yeah. Like one lesson, we did a kitchen still life, and they had to pick 2 or 3 objects from the kitchen, and the parent actually did their version.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I saw that a little bit, and even like siblings kind of doing the same projects together, or one sibling from a different grade would say, "Oh, I want to do what you're doing," and they'd start working together, which was really cool. And with teaching, are there any tips that you would give a newer art teacher, either tips about this whole online experience or just for teaching in general?
Well, for online, I would say just to learn as much as you can. There's so much out there on the internet. These tutorials and just mini videos. It's incredible. It's really incredible. But, and I'm constantly learning as well. And I hope at some point during the summer that I'll be able to, research some new ways of doing things. Like I had trouble working with multiple devices, working on the iPad and then working on the MacBook. And sometimes I would use my iPhone, and it was very, very awkward. And the reason why I wanted to do that was I wanted to be able to work on a piece, to model a piece, and have the camera pointed right on my hand,
Yeah.
Which is kind of hard to do if you're on your computer,
Right.
Yeah, it's like we need more hands.
Yeah. Oh, it is so tricky. Yeah. And so also sort of thinking about teaching and then thinking about your background, do you have any specific artists, and especially Black artists or other artists of color, that you share with students and that you feel like make a big impact on students?
I show them the work of Romare Bearden, and I just think his work is so kid-friendly.
Yeah.
I gravitate to collage because I just feel like with collage, it's so much less intimidating for kids, I think. You don't necessarily know or have had mastered the art of drawing, right? You can cut something out or tear something out. So I like that part. And also Romare Bearden, because, he was so in tune to his own identity. And I feel like it's important for kids to be able to find who they are and to create images that relate to how they see themselves.
Yes.
And then there's Alma Thomas, who's a painter, and she was an educator too for much of her life. And when I used to teach in DC as a full-time artist, I would introduce the kids to her because she was DC, and she was African American, and my kids were primarily African American. And just emphasizing the fact that you don't have to always look outside of yourself. There are models right here in front of us, and the fact that this artist was right here, she lived practically in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And the way she worked, because she was towards the later part of her career abstract, the way she dealt with color, her perspective. Many of her pieces were from like a bird's eye view, from an aerial perspective, an abstracted aerial perspective of her garden.
Right.
Or space. So, the themes were really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and that's more, a lot of it looks like it could be collage.
Yeah, I made it collage.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's what I'm thinking of, that so many of the interpretations are collage.
Other artists like Faith Ringgold and her work, her quilt work, her books, I think are important. Willie Cole.
Yeah.
And these are people that I, admire as well, not on just in relation to my teaching, but Willie Cole with his work with objects, because a lot of my practice centers on materials and objects, and what he does with shoes and water bottles is incredible.
Yeah, really transforming those materials. But then, letting them be like, they still are obviously what they are. Like it's not completely disguised what it's made out of. Yeah, which I actually feel like is in some ways similar to the work that you've been doing with cardboard, that you're like, I was looking at some of the sculptures and wall pieces that you've been making. And just how the cardboard is so transformed, but it's still like very obviously cardboard.
Yeah, that was a draw for me, to take something that has its beginnings in something, like taking a shoebox, for example, and transforming that, deconstructing it really, and making something else out of it. It's fascinating to me. And it had so many implications for me in terms of the message and social political implications of what trash is. What are the things that we hold and value in society? What are the things that we purchase? What are the things that we throw away and discard? It has a lot of parallels in society.
So many layers of meaning there.
Oh, and it's also interesting because it kind of has a connection to my past, because my early work as a graphic designer, I was a package designer for Campbell Soup and Mattel Toys. So there I was designing and creating these intricate packages for these things. And then, now taking these same packages and destroying them and repurposing them, turning them into something else. Yeah, I didn't even realize that until later, after I had started doing it. I said, wow, there's this past connection,
Right. Yeah. And I feel like that also, like, taking those packages apart connects to the history of those packages as well. And like, where did they come from? And, like you're saying, who purchased it and what's the worth now. But I love that you've gone from creating to kind of dismantling these objects.
Something. And in the beginning, I only created from boxes that I purchased, or items that I purchased. So it was interesting because on one level, it became like a snapshot of my consumer habits.
Right.
But I'm not like a shoe person. I have friends that are shoe people, and they have like so many shoe boxes in their closet, but I don't purchase shoes that much. So at one point I needed to go outside of myself. So I started asking people to donate boxes. And then I would go to the shoe stores and ask people to save boxes for me. And I'd walk through the door and they're just like, here comes the shoe lady, the shoe box lady. How many do we have today for?
I love it. And I feel like I actually did a couple of lessons thinking about shoes, and there's a few artists, Tyree Guyton and Shiota Chiharu, both have done work with shoes and like the story that a shoe can tell, where I know Shiota Chiharu was collecting shoes from people in a similar way to your like shoebox collection, but she was asking for them to also write a little note of like, what is the story of your shoe? Where has it been? And,
I love that.
What story does it tell? And then even looking, I think we looked at Van Gogh did a painting of his shoes. So looking at that and saying, well, what do these shoes say? Who wore them? And like, where have they been? They looked old. And, just thinking about those questions. What story does that tell?
Yeah.
And the same thing with the boxes. Like, what story does that tell?
What did it hold? And what meaning did it have for you?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And boxes are interesting in general. They're designed to protect, to hold, maybe to hide.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's people that, put money in shoe boxes and push it under the bed.
Right.
And I wrote a story about pecans. I can't remember the name of it, but it never sold. But it talked about how, it was inspired by the fact that, like, when I was a child in Chicago and I had aunts in Georgia, my parents came, to Chicago from the rural South, Georgia. And some of my aunts, they used to put pecans in shoe boxes and send them to us,
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this story, it was called Sweet Potato Day, about a little girl and her aunts making sweet potato pie in the kitchen. And in one of the pages, it talks about how, the package came in the mail and, the child being curious about what's in it and then opening up and finding pecans. And she was like, pecans? Yeah.
Oh, I love that. And do you share these stories or your books or any of your artwork? Do you share any of that with students?
Yes, because I think it's important that children know that artists, they don't just exist in a vacuum or hidden away in a museum, or, that they're live and vibrant and in your community,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I bring in my books. One of them, Grandma's Purple Flowers, it deals with a girl again and her relationship with her grandma. And so we talk about grandparents and, who has a special relationship with their grandparent and what are some of the memories that you have,
Yeah.
Because everybody has stories to tell.
Beautiful.
And it's a matter of getting those out. And I think even, art with children, art with adults, and just generally, it's all about the story. It's about the narrative. And, who gets the political side of that being who gets to tell your story and, who gets to tell the stories.
Right.
And I think that comes down to like the whole race thing also, that who's going to tell our stories? And we want to be able to tell our stories.
Right.
Everybody wants to tell their own story,
Yeah. And everybody should get to.
Yeah. And not being dictated to by the overarching, story that's put out there.
Right. Yeah. Are there any other ways that you kind of work in your classroom to overcome that? Or how do you create an anti-racist environment? And how are you managing that in your classroom? And what would your kind of advice be around that?
I think you could start with some basics, like even the thing about the story.
Yeah.
Just, putting your story out there, because I think it's the stories that make people human. And I think the whole thing about racism is that it dehumanizes. It makes you less than a person. You're just this stereotype. So I think you can start basically with creating visual narratives or, written narratives about who you are. And like, if you had a chance to tell the world who you are, what would you say? What would you say? I might do that come fall.
Yeah. Yes, I love that. Yeah. For all the grades.
All of them.
And it'd be so nice to see what they do. And I love that how you said visual or written, that, I feel like a lot of times some kids are really stuck when it comes to images, whereas others are more stuck where it comes to words. So giving that kind of flexibility and the option for both is always helpful. And then it also includes, the younger kids that might not be reading yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And all different ability levels.
Absolutely. But in my experience, I feel like young children are more apt to draw than they are to write. And so when during my residency periods at the Kennedy Center, I always start with the art and then we go from there. And once the art is down, they're able to interpret it in words. It's incredible.
Amazing. That's something I struggle with still. still. Like I'll be able to get an image out and then I'll spend ages just trying to figure out, well, I know it says something. I know I was thinking about all these things, but like, how do I articulate it?
How do you put that down on paper? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Like even coming up with titles is so tricky. And I've rewritten my artist statement countless times.
Oh, yeah. That is so painful. That is so painful.
So
yes. Oh, my gosh. But it's necessary, right? Because then again, it's like you want to be able to write your own story. You don't want other people interpreting it, standing the chance of misinterpreting.
Yeah. Right.
Another thing that I did when I was with DCPS, we did this. It was a unit on power in art, which I think was so amazing. And what it did was, this was for fifth grade also. We did this whole exploration of images in art and power images in art. Like I would show them maybe some Renaissance paintings of women, adorned in these huge, beautiful dresses sitting like on, could have been a throne, right? And then we, tried to dissect that, unpack that. Look at her stance. What does it mean? Do you think she was a powerful person? What gives you that idea? Is it the color? Is it the way she's standing or sitting? What about it makes you feel like she's a person that's important? And then we'd look at other pieces where maybe it would be a painting from that period. And then there's like a Caucasian, like lying on like a sofa kind of thing. And then there's like, looks like a servant person behind her carrying something that probably belongs to her, right? And looking at that and saying, well, let's look at that. How does that feel? What does that say about the two people, the relationship of the two people to each other? Who has power in this piece? You know what I mean? Things like that. Yeah. And then we talk about, identifying a time when you felt powerful, another time when you didn't feel powerful. So I think all of these things kind of can be included in lessons regarding race and art, because art is not immune from racism. Racism pervades all aspects of society, Yes. Yeah. And in the art making and the art history, and what kind of images are we exposed to? What kind of images are Black children exposed to, throughout their schooling in art, So it's kind of like dismantling some of that stuff too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what's the guy's name? Kahinde.
Yes. Kahinde Wiley.
Yeah, who kind of is, his whole thing is dismantling some of these things in his work. Yeah. So I show them these pieces of these Kahinde Wiley pieces of this Black man on the horse, and I mean, they're like, oh, wow, this is like amazing, because many of them haven't seen anything like that before. So it just opens up a whole new world of thinking about art and their relationship to art.
Yeah. Yes, I love that his paintings provide for us teachers that we can show these Renaissance paintings and have a rich discussion about it, and then alongside it show his work that is inspired by these, but totally flipping it around. And I really love, I might have to steal that focus on power, because that's an amazing way to look at it and just such a powerful way to look at it.
Yeah. And one thing I noticed during this whole virtual teaching thing was the museums. It was one lesson at a museum where you would take a painting from their collection and then you tried to duplicate it through gesture, costuming. Have you seen that?
Oh, the like the Getty challenge, or that one?
Yes, which I thought was really interesting and cool. Yeah.
One of the artists I talked to recently, Aaron Boswell, did that challenge with his students, and some of the results were just amazing. The way these kids came up with like how to interpret the images. Just incredible. And I loved how kids would like pull in toys that kind of were like the same color as something someone in the painting was holding and use that.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It's just amazing.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Yeah, so that's another great way to tie in art history and like kind of turn it around, make it your own. Thinking more about your work, could you maybe give some advice about showing and selling your work? How have you managed to do that? And kind of what are the best resources that have been helpful along the way?
To show, I think I look online for a lot of that. There's artist calls.
Yeah.
There's different groups that publish artist calls like all the time. And then I think it's important too to connect to your community and see what art organizations exist. Like here, there's a Women's Caucus for Art.
Yeah.
There's Black Artists of DC. There's a Washington Printmakers Group, and there's a sculpture group. So depending on your medium, finding out what organizations exist locally would be a good start.
Right.
And then like if you graduated from a local university or something, you could also check the alumni associations because they often have opportunities posted like on Facebook groups or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And have there been any big barriers that you've overcome in your career? And then how did you do it?
Well, yeah, I think being a Black woman in art is a big one.
Yep. Absolutely.
I think the art world is dominated by white males, and it trickles on down in so many aspects of the art world in terms of having access to opportunities, just even knowing about opportunities and having the connections, people in places that can open doors for you is oftentimes missing. And, you know, I'm just, because of who I am and my personality, I tend to take no's as an opportunity to even push harder. I think there has to be, I don't think you can be a super shy person and be successful in art. Because it takes you get a lot of rejection anyway. It takes a certain hard shelledness to persevere, but just keep pushing at it until the door opens. Because I know even as a writer, illustrator, I lived in California and I had done a bunch of emergent reader books for this teacher. This publishing company was started by teachers. It was called Creative Teaching Press in California when I lived there. And I did a bunch of like emergent readers, and I wanted to break into trade books. And there was a conference in town. It was called the Booksellers Association or something like that. They changed their name since then. But the convention came to town and I'm like, I'm going. And because of some former connections I had in printing or in publishing, there's a guy from one of the smaller presses I used to do work for was there, and he gave me a pass. So I went with my portfolio and everything, and thinking that I'd be able to talk to some other publishers. Well, it was not the best idea, but I was able to break through. Basically, at those type of conventions, they don't want to see talent. They want to see booksellers, you know. But I was determined because I felt like this is an opportunity that only comes up like once every, several years. So I kept pushing, and every publisher would say, no, we don't see artists here at this event, you know. But I talked to a publisher, Lee and Low Books. They're out of New York, and they're one of the few multicultural children's book publishers around. I showed them some of my work, and they liked it, and they said, oh, we don't have anything that would fit your particular style. And all of my children's books are done in cut paper collage, right?
Yeah.
So they're just like, oh, well, if something comes up, we'll let you know. And I thought to myself when I left that day, oh, yeah, right. You probably tell everybody that. But 2 years, it took 2 years, and I get a call from them, and they had a manuscript for me. I think it was called My Steps, about some children playing, on their steps through the seasons. So it's stuff like that, where I could have just, after that first no, walked away, or that second no, or the third no.
Yeah.
But just,
But you kept at it.
Yeah, being able to persist helped me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as a result, I have 5 books from them or something. But
wow.
Yeah.
And some of them are that you've both written and illustrated.
Yeah. The Grandma's Purple Flowers was written and illustrated by me. And then I have 2 smaller, like emergent readers, Go Go Gumbo and Everybody Wears Braids.
Ah, I love that. And how did that shift, like from being the illustrator to being both author and illustrator?
Well, I just felt like it was a natural progression.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell my kids all the time in school that you can be good at something, but you can push yourself and, of course, be better at something and then challenge yourself, something that you feel like, oh, I could never do that. Try it, and you can be successful. Because I had illustrated at that time, I think it was like 8 or 9 books I had illustrated. And I said, it was like an aha moment for me that, wait a minute, now I can illustrate other people's works. Why can't I write my own work? Because you have a lot of illustrator artists out there, like, from Eric Carle to
right.
Ezra Jack Keats, the other artists that I had mentioned for my kids, Faith Ringgold, you have that. So why can't I be that, and I tried and I was able to break in, which was thrilling for me.
Amazing. And it's interesting to me I'm just looking at the books and the collage that you use there, and then kind of seeing little bits of that echoed in your like fine art work, but they are also so different.
The illustration?
Yeah, the illustration and the books versus like your prints and your sculptures and wall pieces. And I'm curious how you kind of like wrap your head around all of these projects that are always going on.
Yeah, well, with illustration, you are bound to the words, right? So you have something very concrete that you're operating or launching from. Whereas with my fine art work, I work very intuitively and I pull things out of like what I see. I don't often come in saying, okay, well, this is going to be a piece about this and that. Mm-hmm. I start working and there are things and themes that are suggested through like the colors and the energy, the line work. Yeah. So I operate on really different levels with them.
Do you kind of have projects going in both simultaneously?
Yeah, I'll be working on the wall constructions and everything, and then working on an idea for an illustration for something or a story.
Yeah. And do you feel like you almost need to have both going on? Like it would seem to me like they kind of tap into different parts of the brain or different sides of you and are like releases in different ways.
Yeah. And I guess that's just my personality. It's like, I can't just have one thing. I have to have 3 or 4 different, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's detrimental, but it's just the kind of energy that I have that I'm constantly working on multiple things at one time.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
It's amazing. It's meant that you have like several successful careers going on.
But I think the main thing now is just, it's my teaching practice and then the practice of creating the prints and the wall installations and floor pieces. Yeah. Even though I'm also working on a book project, an artist book project that relates to what I've been experiencing during this time of COVID and everything.
Yeah.
And working on some writing related to that too for the National Art Education Association. Yeah, NAEA. Yeah, they had a call for narratives and everything relating to working during this period.
That'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I think everybody has had some really incredible experiences during this period, and to just document it, I think is important.
Yeah. Has that process kind of helped you through it?
Well, I didn't really think about like my response to it until recently, because when you're in it, you don't really think about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You think about it, but on a kind of surface level, like, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to work through it? But then after school closed, then it gave me a little bit more time. And all through it, though, the first month was really hard being isolated. But after that, I started taking walks and taking photographs of the things that I saw, which was comforting to me because I don't think I even went outside for 3 weeks. It was crazy.
Right. Yeah, we were similarly kind of holed up.
Yeah, because just not really knowing, like what this really is, and oof.
Yeah.
But like documenting goes back to the who's going to tell the story of this and wanting to be included in the stories that are told during this period. So that motivates me to write and to create.
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe just thinking of all the things that you have going on, could you kind of like walk us through a week or a day? Like what does time look like for you? How are you kind of managing all the different aspects of what you do?
I have to write things down. I have to write things down, and then like being a visual person, I'll put things on Post-it notes and put them on the wall, and put it in categories. Like I was interviewed by the Studio Visit. It's online. And so I had to clean up my studio for that. That, and then getting ready for this interview even helped me to reflect on, my life and what I'd been doing over the decades, and then this book project that's coming up, this artist book project, it's going to take a year to do it. It's a collaborative with 8 other artists.
Wow.
And then I work with a collective called Women of an Undetermined Age, WOAUA. Yeah. And we meet, like every other week, and we talk about our art and share what we're working on and everything. Working with that. And,
that sounds amazing.
Yeah. So lots of irons and a lot of fires, but my biggest struggle is getting the work done, So like, I guess in a given week, none of my weeks are ever like the same.
Right.
But like my week in school, like your day, of course, starts like 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. By the time you get home, it's maybe 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, depending on what I'm working on. And then just trying to carve out some time in the evening, if not actually putting my hands on the work, trying to come up with a plan for the work or writing about the work,
Right.
And then on weekends are always a monster because you're trying to do everything that you couldn't do during the week, but still trying to carve out some time for your practice,
Yeah.
So it's just an ongoing struggle.
Yeah. And then finding time for all the other, like taking care of yourself, taking care of if you have a family or, partner or kids.
Yeah. I must say, though, it has gotten a bit easier, of course, than when the children were little.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like I'm starting this new life because all of the children are out. My son, the youngest, is 23, and he graduated a couple of years ago. But everybody's in different cities. And, we get together virtually when we can, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of FaceTiming or Zooming.
Yes. And I'm about zoomed out, especially during the virtual period. I was just like, oh my God. And in the evenings, there were always these different activities that you could partake in, at museums, and everything. And, I was always like, oh, this sounds great. I want to do this from 7 to 9. And then when you get down to it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't think I could do this. I can't be online all day and then do this at night. No way.
Yeah, it gets to be too much. Yeah, I feel a little bit the same way. I was partially excited that I would be able to like attend an opening because it was online. And usually my daughter's in bed and I can't just like leave the house with her in bed to go to an opening. So it was almost like it opened a new door. But then, often I felt the same as you. Like I just want to spend that time making something with my hands and not being online.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Oh. And another thing I wanted to mention, as far as he had asked me if there was any advice for like new teachers, to take advantage of the education programs at these museums. Sometimes they're free.
Yeah.
And I attended maybe one virtual one during this whole virtual teaching thing, but they're so rich and there's so many resources that they give you, including like before virtual materials for your classroom, posters of artists and everything. It was quite nice.
Yeah, that's true.
And then organizations like the National Art Education Association in my community in the DC area, they have DCEA or something like that. But it's the DC arm of NAEA, and they had events and, get-togethers with teaching artists, sharing of resources. It's quite helpful.
Yeah. Like take advantage of all the resources that are out there. Oh, one more that sometimes I forget this question, but I feel like people ask this a lot is how do you overcome creative blocks? So if you're ever stuck, how do you get past that? Or are you not stuck because you have so many things going on?
Just go on to something else, I'm working on. Because sometimes I think the stuckness is important because that's the period when you can let an idea incubate and just sit. Just sitting with an idea for a while, I think helps. And I think it's a part of the creative process, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, the downtime.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's like the incubation time. You've got to let that idea grow and mature on its own, and then it'll pop out when it's ready.
Yes, yes.
Oh, is there anything that you're sort of curious about right now? I know you talked about a few projects going on, but any topics that are like front of mind?
Topics in my art, you mean?
Yeah, in your art or things that you're thinking about for new work.
I'm still intrigued by this whole notion of materials and objects and what they mean in a society. So, I've been working with cardboard for about 5-6 years, and I'm still curious about how I can incorporate like two different aspects of my practice, like the printmaking part with the sculpture constructions that I'm doing. I want to be able to print on cardboard and make prints from cardboard in addition to creating the structures. So I still haven't quite figured out how to do that yet, but I've done some of it. Yeah. But I feel like I'm at the beginning of that journey. So I'd like to, continue with that.
Yeah. Looking at your more recent cardboard pieces and seeing, a little bit of that happening, like the prints it almost looks like attached to the cardboard. But then still seeing that like tear away, cut away. Like I really like how we see bits of the interior of that cardboard, and almost like the cardboard has its like guts spilling out.
Yeah, I'm just so fascinated. It's so amazing how you can just be so fascinated about something, right? Yeah.
I think that's the nature of artists. Like we're always fascinated with these textures and, little things. Okay. I have a fun kind of question. What is your go-to order at your favorite restaurant?
What is the name of that? Chicken Penang, which is a Thai dish, spicy.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes I feel almost bad asking because I know a lot of us are not able to get the food from our favorite restaurants.
Yes, I tell you. Yeah, when I think about it, I have not been to a restaurant in over 3 months.
Yeah, me neither. It's a lot. Yeah. And then is there anybody that you would want to thank or give like a shout out to?
I think to my kids, Kadala, Cass, and Hyacinth.
So sweet. I love that. Do you feel like they inspire your work a lot?
They inspired a lot of my children's books and my illustrations, and I used them to model for many of the illustrations.
That's great.
Yeah.
And kind of final thing, where can our listeners connect with you online?
Well, they can email me, Adjoa at adjoaburrowes.com. I have a page on Instagram. If you search for me by name, I have some artwork up on fineartamerica.com. And if you put my name in, my work will come up. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I can link to everything as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so informative. I feel like I've been taking notes and I feel like you just have so much wisdom to share.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity, really, to talk about my work and my teaching.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I feel like we could keep going, but there's so much there. And there's, so many layers of your career, and I keep looking at your artwork. Like I'm looking at that Fine Art America page, and I love the cardboard pieces, but the prints also have these layers and this texture that's just incredible.
And I just feel like, I'm like standing in the footprints of all of these great artists that came before me, whose expressions were just so powerful and compelling. It's such a draw.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Wow. Adjoa's words at the end about standing in the footprints of great artists are so powerful. Her story and her grit provide such motivation. To hear how she kept pushing to become a children's book illustrator and then author by continuing despite hearing no again and again. "Keep pushing at it until the door opens," she said. Yes, force those doors to open for you. I also loved her response to creative block, just sitting in that stuckness and letting it be time for incubation of an idea. She talked about how that pause, that slowing down, is part of the creative process. Soak up her wisdom. And do not forget, our exhibit, See Where It Takes You, is on view now at tapexhibit.com. Go check it out. Help us spread the word by sharing it with your networks. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can reach me at Teaching Artist Podcast on Instagram or teachingartistpodcast@gmail.com. Who do you want to hear from? Please share your recommendations of teaching artists. And if you loved this episode, please subscribe, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow me. It really makes a big difference. Thank you.